Somewhere in the world right now, it's dark and quiet. Maybe you're lying in bed listening to this, city sounds drifting through a cracked window, or maybe you're somewhere completely still, countryside dark, no traffic, just the sound of your own breathing. Wherever you are, pause for a second and imagine something. Imagine that, outside your window, there is no city, no roads, no lights on the horizon, just land stretching out in every direction, enormous and ancient and completely unknowing of what it will one day become. That's where this story begins. And if you want to tell me where you're listening from and what time it is, drop it in the comments. I genuinely read them, and there's something quietly wonderful about seeing Berlin at dawn and Auckland at midnight, and Chicago somewhere in between, all listening to the same story at the same time. Also, if you're on Spotify, you can follow the show there for ad-free, music-free listening, and it genuinely helps keep this going. Link is in the description. Now, Australia. 50,000 years ago, give or take, a group of people arrived at the edge of a continent that had never once in the entire history of life heard a human voice. No one had ever stood on that coastline before. No human foot had touched that soil. No human eye had looked out across those inland plains or watched the sun come up over those ancient red ranges. And then, one day, someone did. A small group of people, exhausted probably, certainly hungry, possibly terrified, stepped ashore and looked around at a world utterly unlike anything their ancestors had known. What happened next is one of the most extraordinary stories in all of human history. And the strange thing is, we're still only beginning to understand it. Here's the mystery. We know people reached the continent we now call Australia at least 50,000 years ago, possibly 60,000, possibly more. The evidence is real. It's been found in the ground, in rock shelters, along ancient lake beds buried under layers of time so thick it almost defies imagination. We know they came. We know they survived. We know that their descendants built one of the longest continuous cultural traditions in the history of our species. But the how, the exactly when, the precise routes, the specific technologies, the experience of that first crossing, all of that remains partly, beautifully, frustratingly unknown. And that mystery is the reason this story is worth telling. The continent they arrived at was not quite the Australia you'd recognise on a map today. This was the Ice Age, and the world wore a different shape. Sea levels were dramatically lower than they are now, low enough that Australia, New Guinea and Tasmania were all connected into one massive landmass that geographers and archaeologists today call Sahul. It was bigger than modern Australia by a significant margin, with coastlines hundreds of kilometres from where they sit today, great plains where there is now shallow sea, river valleys that are now drowned and silent under warm water. The land itself was a stranger. Giant animals moved through it, creatures that hadn't yet encountered anything like a human being. The climate was colder and drier in some places, stranger in others. It was a world operating on its own logic, ancient and self-contained. And somewhere across a stretch of open ocean, people decided to cross it. That is the question that keeps researchers and dreamers alike awake at night, or maybe gently eased into sleep. How do you cross an ocean you cannot see the other side of, using only what you can build with your hands, navigating by stars and current and wind and instinct, carrying everything you need to start a life on the other side, if there even is another side? Because here's the thing, even at the lowest sea levels of the last ice age, even when Sahul had stretched itself as close to the Southeast Asian islands as it ever would, there was still open water between them. The crossing was never a walk, it was always a voyage, possibly the first intentional ocean crossing in human history. We have no boats from that time. None. Wood doesn't survive 50,000 years, and neither does bamboo or rope or any of the materials those first mariners would have used. We have no logs of their journey, no maps, no names, no memory that has survived in a form we can simply read. What we do have is something quieter, and in its own way, more remarkable. We have stones, sharpened, shaped, deliberately made tools found in layers of earth so old the dates make your head swim. We have ash, the remains of ancient fires lit by human hands in rock shelters and on open ground. We have bones, some animal, some human, telling us in their chemistry and their placement that people were here, that they ate, that they buried their dead, that they lived. We have pigments, ochre pressed into rock, images made by people who wanted to leave something of themselves behind. And increasingly we have DNA, genetic evidence carried in the cells of living people whose ancestry stretches in an unbroken line back to those first arrivals, 50,000 years of inheritance written in molecules. Each piece of evidence is a fragment. Taken alone, none of it tells the whole story. Taken together, they begin to sketch the outline of something almost impossible to comprehend. A people crossing the edge of the known world and building something that would last longer than almost any other human culture on Earth. So here is what this story is. It's a scientific investigation, piecing together clues from disciplines as different as archaeology and genetics and geology and oceanography. But it's also something else. It's a human story about courage, probably. About curiosity, almost certainly. About the extraordinary things ordinary people are capable of when survival demands the best of them. Tonight or this morning or whatever hour finds you here, we're going to follow them. From the islands of Southeast Asia to the shores of an unknown continent, through Ice Age landscapes, across flooded coastlines, into the deep interior of a world that had never heard a human voice. We're going to look at the evidence, sit with the uncertainty, and try to imagine what it might have felt like to be first. To be the ones who arrived. To be the people who looked out at 50,000 years of history ahead of them and had absolutely no idea. Let's begin. To understand what those first people were walking into, you have to first erase the map you know. Take the mental image of Australia you carry around. That familiar shape, the wide northwestern shelf, the Gulf of Carpentaria cutting in from the north, the long straight bight of the Great Australian Bight in the south, Bass Strait separating the mainland from Tasmania. Now imagine draining the ocean, not all of it, but enough. Drop sea levels by somewhere between 100 and 120 metres, which is roughly what the Ice Age had done by locking so much of the world's water into massive polar ice sheets, and the continent you're looking at changes dramatically. Coastlines push outward, shallow seas become plains. Islands merge into peninsulas, and three land masses that today are separated by open water, Australia, New Guinea and Tasmania, become a single continuous landmass stretching from the tropics almost to the edge of the Antarctic zone. Geologists call this place Sahul, and it was enormous. Bigger than modern Australia by a margin that's hard to quite picture. The extra land wasn't scattered in thin strips around the edges. It was substantial, hundreds of kilometres of new territory on some coastlines, whole plains and river valleys now sitting silently under 50 or 100 metres of warm sea. The northwest shelf alone, where the water today is relatively shallow, would have extended far out into what is now the Indian Ocean. The Gulf of Carpentaria, which today is an inland sea biting deep into northern Australia, didn't exist. It was dry land, possibly a rich and productive landscape of wetlands and grasslands and river systems. People may have lived there for thousands of years before the sea eventually rose and claimed it. This is one of the most important things to understand about the archaeology of early Australia, which is that much of it is gone. The places where people are most likely to have first made landfall, the coastal fringes where resources were richest, where fresh water met the sea, where fish and shellfish and seabirds would have made a newly arrived population's survival considerably easier, those places are now underwater. When researchers talk about the earliest human presence in Sahul, they're already working with a truncated record. The coastline those first people knew is not a coastline anyone can walk today. It's not a place you can excavate in the conventional sense. You'd need a submarine. Some researchers have actually begun proposing exactly that: systematic underwater archaeological surveys of ancient drowned coastlines. A few tentative discoveries have already been made off the coast of Western Australia, but mostly the early coastal story is buried beneath the sea, and we may never fully recover it. What we can do is look at what Sahul was like from the inside: the climate, the landscape, the ecosystems those first arrivals would have encountered once they moved inland or settled along stretches of coast that the rising sea hadn't yet taken. The climate of Ice Age Sahul was not simply a colder version of modern Australia. It was genuinely different in character. The interior was drier and colder than today, more intensely arid in places where there is already very little rain now, and probably windier, with dust storms moving across open plains on a scale that's hard to compare to anything in the modern world. Lake Eyre, which today fills only rarely after exceptional rains, may have been both larger and more productive at certain periods, and then brutally contracted at others. The monsoon systems that today bring seasonal rain to the north were present, but shifted, sometimes more intense, sometimes weaker, running on rhythms that don't perfectly match what we see now. Southern and western regions were cold enough in winter to produce conditions that would have required careful planning, good shelter, reliable fire, and a detailed working knowledge of where resources could be found across the seasons. And yet, for all its harshness, Sahul was also extraordinarily rich. The tropics in the north offered year-round warmth and an enormous diversity of plants and animals. The coasts, however deep underwater they now sit, would have offered protein and calories in abundance to people who knew how to find them. Inland river systems, some now dry, supported productive wetland environments. Forests covered parts of the southeast and southwest that are today much more open. The continent was not a single thing. It was a mosaic: harsh desert and lush floodplain, ancient weathered ranges and young river valleys, environments that could sustain human life in very different ways, each requiring its own specific knowledge, its own toolkit, its own accumulated wisdom. And then there were the animals. The creatures that early people encountered in Sahul were not the ones we know today. Or rather, many of them weren't. Walking into Sahul 50,000 years ago, you would have entered an ecosystem operating according to rules that had been in place for millions of years, and one of those rules was that nothing there had ever seen a human being. The animals had no framework for understanding what a human was, no instinctive fear, no learned avoidance behavior, no reason to run. Researchers call the large animals of this ancient world megafauna, and Sahul had them in spectacular variety. There was Diprotodon, the largest marsupial that ever lived, an animal something like a very large wombat scaled up to the size of a hippopotamus, grazing across the plains in numbers that we can only estimate from fossil beds. There were giant, short-faced kangaroos, forms we no longer have any living analogue for, some of them probably able to reach vegetation several meters off the ground. There was Procoptodon, a kangaroo that stood roughly 3 meters tall and may have moved in a way quite unlike any living relative. Thylacoleo carnifex, the marsupial lion, was a predator with a bite force estimated to have been extraordinarily powerful, built for ambush hunting in a landscape where very large prey was available. There were giant monitor lizards, possibly including forms that dwarf anything alive today, giant flightless birds, enormous land-dwelling crocodilians. A world that looked in some ways like a parallel evolution to the large animal communities of Africa, but stranger, filtered through 50 million years of isolated marsupial development. What happened to these animals is one of the genuinely contested questions in the study of early Sahul. Most of the megafauna were gone by about 40,000 years ago, perhaps earlier in some cases. The debate about why, which has been running for decades and shows no sign of final resolution, centres on two forces: climate change and human hunting. Some researchers argue that the aridification of the Ice Age was already putting pressure on megafauna populations before people arrived, that the climate shift was the primary driver of extinction and human arrival was at most a final stress on already struggling species. Others argue that the coincidence of timing is too strong to dismiss, that large, naive animals encountering skilled hunters for the first time would have been devastatingly vulnerable, easy to approach, slow to learn fear, and unable to adjust their reproduction rates fast enough to recover from even moderate hunting pressure. The most careful current thinking tends to sit somewhere between these positions. Probably both were factors. Probably the balance varied by species and by region. The honest answer is that we don't yet know with certainty. What we can say is that the people who arrived in Sahul were walking into an ecosystem of staggering scale and novelty. They had never seen these animals before. The animals had never seen them. Everything about the encounter, what happened in the first generations of contact, how knowledge about these creatures was accumulated and shared, what strategies people developed for hunting them or avoiding the dangerous ones, all of that had to be invented from scratch, built out of careful observation and accumulated experience in a landscape that had no instructions attached. That is worth sitting with for a moment. Not the dates, not the sea level figures, not the taxonomic names of extinct marsupials, but the human reality underneath all of it. A small group of people arriving at the edge of a continent that had never once in its history hosted their species, looking out at animals and plants and landscapes and weather patterns none of their ancestors had ever encountered, and having to figure it out, needing to learn what was safe to eat and what would kill them, where the water was and when it would dry up, which animals were dangerous and how to avoid them, which plants flowered in which season and where the best hunting grounds were as the year turned. They had no library, no one to ask, only what they had brought with them, which was intelligence, curiosity, and however many thousand years of accumulated human problem-solving skill had been packed into their heads and their hands before they ever crossed the water. That knowledge and what they built from it in this extraordinary new world is where the story is about to go. To follow those first Australians, you have to turn around and watch where they came from. The story doesn't begin on the shores of Sahul. It begins thousands of kilometres to the northwest, in a world of tropical forests, flooded rivers, and long chains of islands stretching away into the sea, like stepping stones someone had thoughtfully laid down in advance. By the time any human feet touched Sahul, Homo sapiens had already been moving through Asia for tens of thousands of years. Not in a straight, purposeful march, the way an arrow crosses a map, but in slow pulses and eddies, families drifting into new valleys, hunting bands following migrations of game, small groups splitting, recombining, fanning out, then sometimes vanishing completely. Think about those first expansions out of Africa. A few hundred people crossing into the Arabian Peninsula, hugging coasts and river systems, moving when the rains failed, or when a new stretch of shoreline looked promising. Over thousands of years their descendants seeped eastward into India, then further along the edge of the Indian Ocean into what is now Bangladesh, Myanmar, Thailand, Malaysia. Each generation might only have moved a few days' walk from where they were born. But time is patient. After 1,000 generations, even a cautious people can end up at the edge of the known world. Southeast Asia in the late Ice Age was not a scatter of islands separated by deep blue ocean, the way a modern atlas shows it. Like Sahul, it too had been reshaped by low sea levels. The shallow continental shelf that now lies under the South China Sea was exposed as dry land, forming a vast region archaeologists call Sunda. Mainland Southeast Asia, Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam blurred into this extended peninsula, which ran down to what are now Java, Sumatra and Borneo, all linked in a single continuous block of land. That great landmass ended in a ragged southern edge. And beyond that edge, there were islands. To the southeast, across straits where the sea never fully retreated, lay a broken arc of smaller landmasses: Sulawesi, the Lesser Sundas, Timor, the Moluccas. Beyond them, invisible over the curve of the horizon, was Sahul. Between Sunda and Sahul was a permanent barrier, a zone of deep water and swift currents we now call Wallacea. No amount of sea level drop could turn that into dry land. To get from Asia to Australia, you had to cross water. Not once, but several times. The people who eventually did this almost certainly did not think of themselves as setting out for a new continent. They were simply moving through a world their ancestors had been exploring for a long time. But the path they took through those islands, and when they took it, is something we can only glimpse in fragments. The fragments come in two main forms: bones and stones in the ground, and tiny chemical signatures in living people's cells. On the archaeological side, we have scattered sites across Southeast Asia and Wallacea that show modern humans present tens of thousands of years before Australia is firmly on the record. In northern Borneo, in parts of Vietnam and Laos, in Java and Sumatra, stone tools and human remains hint at a complex, layered history of occupation. Some of these traces are from earlier human species, Homo erectus, the hobbits of Flores, but by around 70,000 to 60,000 years ago, Homo sapiens is clearly in the mix. On islands inside Wallacea, the story sharpens. On Sulawesi, hand stencils and animal paintings on cave walls have been dated to over 40,000 years ago, possibly earlier. That means that by the time similar ages show up in Australia, people with fully modern symbolic behaviour were already living on islands that required at least short sea crossings to reach. On Timor and nearby islands, layers of shell and fishbone tell of people who knew how to exploit deep-water fish, creatures you don't reliably catch by standing in the surf. Someone was building boats or rafts or something that could take them beyond the sight of shore and back again. The genetic clues tell another part of the story. When researchers look at the DNA of Aboriginal Australians and Papuans, they see signs of an early separation from other non-African populations. The split seems to date somewhere around 60,000 to maybe 55,000 years ago, give or take a few thousand years either side. That timing lines up, broadly, with groups of Homo sapiens who had already spread along the southern Asian coasts and into Southeast Asia. It suggests that the ancestors of the first Australians branched off, moved through this region, and then took their own path into Sahul. But it does not look like that path was necessarily a single, neat wave. One of the debates that keeps archaeologists and geneticists awake at conferences, but hopefully not you listening to this at night, is whether Australia was peopled by one main founding movement or by multiple pulses of migration over time. A single wave picture is simple and elegant. A core ancestral population, somewhere in Southeast Asia or Wallacea, sends out one major dispersal. A few hundred people, maybe less, island hop through Wallacea in a relatively short period, arrive in Sahul, and then burst out across the continent and into what is now New Guinea and Tasmania. Their descendants diversify in place, with all later differences evolving locally. The multiple waves picture is messier, but in some ways more realistic. It imagines that different groups left Asia at different times. Some might have reached parts of northern Sahul earlier, others later. Some might have taken a more northerly route via Sulawesi and New Guinea, others a southern one through Timor towards northwest Australia. These waves might have partially replaced or mixed with earlier arrivals. Over tens of thousands of years, the traces of those different movements would blend, leaving a complicated genetic and cultural patchwork. Hints of this complexity appear in the DNA. Certain Aboriginal Australian groups carry slightly different patterns of ancestry from others, suggesting that the ancient movements into Sahul may not have been a single uniform event. Papuan populations also show signs of their own unique history, with deep branches and possible later inputs. But genetics works with averages and probabilities. It doesn't hand us a neat travel itinerary. The safest way to put it for now is that there was at least one successful early movement into Sahul, and quite possibly more than one, over a span of thousands of years. None of this happened in a vacuum. Migration isn't magic. People don't just walk into the ocean because they're bored. They move when something pushes, something pulls, or often both at once. In Southeast Asia during this period, the environment was anything but stable. Glacial cycles made sea levels rise and fall. Coastlines advanced, then retreated. Low-lying plains flooded, turning hunting grounds into shallow seas. Rivers changed course, forests expanded during wetter phases, then shrank back when conditions dried. A camp that had been perfectly placed for a generation might, in a descendant's lifetime, become marginal or untenable. At the same time, new opportunities kept appearing. When sea levels were low, Sunda was huge, with broad coastal plains, river deltas, mangrove swamps, and rich estuaries that would have supported abundant fish, shellfish, and bird life. Island chains that are now separated by wide stretches of water lay much closer together. The distances between stepping stones were not trivial, but they were shorter, more manageable, especially for people who already understood tides, currents, and the behaviour of the winds. Imagine living in such a place. You grow up in a community that already has stories about the islands out there, about ancestors who crossed narrow straits, about times when the sea was lower or higher. You learn to fish, to read the sky, to watch how driftwood moves on different days. You hear that beyond the next island there is another, where the water is sweeter, the game more plentiful, or the spirits more favourable. Now add pressure. Maybe a drought that lasts longer than your grandparents remember. Maybe too many people using the same hunting grounds. Maybe a volcanic eruption darkens the sky and chokes a valley for years. Suddenly, the cost of staying rises. The risk of moving, which was always there, begins to look less daunting by comparison. Under those conditions, small experimental journeys become more appealing. A canoe sent out to see what lies beyond the horizon is not a heroic voyage of discovery in the modern sense. It's a gamble taken by people with enough knowledge to think it might pay off. Sometimes it won't. Sometimes boats don't come back. But occasionally they will, bringing news of land, of rivers, of new stands of sago or bamboo, of beaches littered with shellfish, and maybe, eventually, of a lower, darker shape far to the south that is not like the ordinary islands. Something larger, something different. Over thousands of years, those little experiments accumulate. A temporary fishing camp on an outer island becomes a seasonal stopover. A seasonal stopover becomes a more permanent settlement. Kin ties stretch across chains of islands. Children grow up thinking of crossings their great-grandparents would have considered extravagant as nothing special. At some point in that long chain of incremental steps, the route into Sahul became not only imaginable but feasible. People had boats, knowledge of winds and currents, social connections that could support small groups striking out from familiar coasts. They didn't know they were sailing or drifting or paddling towards what we now call Australia. They only knew they were following the same logic their ancestors had always followed, moving in search of better chances for their children, away from failing landscapes and towards new ones. The first steps out of Asia, then, were not sudden strides, but a kind of slow, patient feeling of the way, through forests and rivers, and then along island chains where each crossing made the next one easier to contemplate. The edge of the world did not look like a cliff. It looked like one more faint line of dark hills rising out of the sea, far off in the southern haze. Closing that final stretch of water, that is where the story turns from gradual expansion to genuine leap. And it's there, in the crossing into Sahul itself, that we'll go next. That last stretch was different. All the earlier moves from Africa into Arabia, along India's coasts across the broad plains of Sunda, and the shorter channels between its islands, those could be done with wet feet and short hops. Even the jumps through Wallacea, though they required boats of some kind, often kept the next island in sight, a grey smudge on the horizon, something your eyes could fix on as your arms, and back did the work. But between Wallacea and Sahul, even at the lowest sea levels, there was no continuous bridge of land. No amount of ice locked up in glaciers could turn that region into a simple walk. At some point your ancestors had to commit themselves to stretches of open water where, once they lost sight of the island behind them, they would not yet see the one ahead. This is one of the quiet marvels of the story. Whoever first reached Sahul did something that no earlier human had to do at that scale. They crossed a marine barrier that never fully disappeared. They didn't just wade, they voyaged. How exactly they did it is one of the great unsolved puzzles, in part because watercraft almost never fossilize. A wooden canoe, a lashed log raft, a frame of branches covered in bark or hides. These are the kinds of things the sea and soil are very good at erasing. What we get instead are clues around the edges. On some islands of Wallacea, we see dense layers of fish bones from species that live far from shore, in deep water. Those aren't the fish you spear in the shallows or scoop out of tide pools. They suggest lines, hooks and craft, stable enough to take people out where they couldn't see the bottom. In shell middens we see species that live around offshore reefs, again hinting at repeated use of boats. On Timor and nearby islands, the quantity of these remains builds up over thousands of years. That implies a tradition, not a single lucky experiment. We can't dig up an ancient boat, set it on a museum stand, and point to it as the vessel that carried the first Australians. But we can outline the range of possibilities. The simplest end of that range looks like a raft, bundles of buoyant wood tied together, perhaps with crosspieces to keep them from rolling. Large bamboo stands, if available, would have been ideal, hollow, tough, and naturally floatable. Add a raised platform for people and cargo, and you have something that can ride swells and carry a small group with their tools, water, and food. A step up in sophistication would be canoes hollowed from logs with fire and stone tools, maybe with outriggers, smaller floats attached on one side or both to keep the boat from tipping. That design is common in many later Austronesian societies. It might have much deeper roots. With an outrigger canoe and a bit of sail, or a team of strong paddlers, distances of tens of kilometres over open water become manageable if still risky. More complex still would be plank-built boats, lashed together with plant fibres, with shaped hulls and proper sails. Some researchers think something like this might have existed, because the numbers involved in successfully colonising Sahul are hard to achieve with tiny, fragile craft. But here the evidence thins to almost nothing. It's safer to say that the people who made it to Sahul had at least reliable rafts or dugouts, and possibly much more. Navigation is another shadowy part of the story. No ancient compass sits in the dirt waiting to be unearthed. What we do have are the basic rules of how seas and skies work, and the knowledge that humans everywhere, when they spend generations on the water, learn to read them with astonishing precision. In Wallacea, currents funnel between islands in relatively predictable ways. Winds shift with seasons. Clouds tend to bunch above land in certain patterns. Birds commute between roosting sites on islands, often flying out at dawn and back at dusk along habitual routes. Even if you never stretch a string over a map, you can learn, over a lifetime of fishing and short voyages, that if you leave this headland at this tide, with that wind, and keep the sunrise on your left shoulder, you'll reach another island by midday. Beyond that, there are the stars. By 50,000 or 60,000 years ago, our ancestors were fully modern in brain and body. They had language complex enough to pass on detailed knowledge. It would be surprising if they had not, over countless clear tropical nights, noticed that certain stars rise and set along consistent paths, that particular configurations mark directions and seasons. Whether they used them systematically, The way later Pacific navigators did, we can't say. But the possibility is there, glimmering above those dark prehistoric seas. However they steered, these crossings were not casual, one-person affairs. To establish a viable population on the far side, you need numbers. A single family marooned on a new coast is more likely to die out than to found a continent's worth of descendants. Genetic models suggest at least dozens and more comfortably hundreds of people making it over within a relatively short window of time. That doesn't mean one giant armada. It might mean repeated crossings, season after season, over many years. But even so, each trip would have required planning. Water is heavy, food spoils, people get tired, children cry. If the crossing took a day or two, perhaps hugging currents that helped push them along, they would still need enough fresh water per person to get there, and some reserve in case of delay. They would need food that kept well in the sun and salt, dried meat or fish, nuts, roots packed in baskets or skin bags. They would have to think about fire, a few embers wrapped in damp moss or carried in a container, or the confidence that someone on board could make a new fire quickly in strange surroundings. Then there were tools, stone blades, points and hammerstones, perhaps plant fibres for making more rope or nets, maybe small animals like dogs, if those later companions had already joined human journeys. All of this had to fit into finite space without capsizing whatever they were riding. Because of these constraints, archaeologists and anthropologists debate what kind of trip this really was. One scenario imagines conscious exploration. Experienced seafarers already used to moving between islands, intentionally aiming for faint smudges on the horizon or for the general direction from which driftwood and bird flocks arrived. They might have set off knowing that, even if they missed their target, prevailing currents would carry them into land somewhere further along. In this picture, crossing to Sahul is the culmination of a long tradition of planned voyages. Another scenario leans on drift and accident. People fish or travel along familiar routes. A storm blows them far off course. They lose sight of both origin and destination, and eventually wash up on a shore they've never seen. Some die, some survive, and if enough of them did, their descendants become the founding population, over thousands of years with sea levels rising and falling. Even rare events like this could, in theory, be enough. Most researchers now lean toward a blend of both. Pure chance without any seafaring skill seems unlikely to move a large enough group with enough tools and knowledge across multiple deep channels. Purely planned colonization, with survey voyages and return trips, sounds a bit too neat for a world without metal, compasses or charts. The compromise picture is of people who were already competent on the water, who understood that islands lay beyond the rim of their familiar world, and who occasionally pushed further than anyone had before, sometimes by design, sometimes under duress. Whichever mixture you prefer, the outcome is the same. At some point, a cluster of boats or rafts left the last islands of Wallacea and failed in the best possible way to make it back. They reached new land instead, unfamiliar coastlines, strange tides, different constellations rising over the horizon. Those first landfalls on Sahul, the river mouths, beaches and headlands where tired arms pulled craft ashore and feet sank into a new continent's sand, are lost to us now. The sea has climbed and retreated again since then. Shorelines have shifted by hundreds of kilometres. But we can still trace, in the pattern of ancient campsites and tools, the routes those early Australians took once they had crossed the water and stepped into their new world. The simplest way to imagine it is to think of a small flotilla grounding on some quiet, tropical shore in what is now northern Australia or southern New Guinea, and then to erase almost everything you see, because the coastlines they reached are gone. When those first people crossed from Wallacea into Sahul, sea levels were far lower than today. The northern edge of the continent did not sit where the present beaches of Arnhem Land or Cape York do now. Instead, there was a broad, swampy, river-laced shelf stretching far to the north, a drowned world that now lies under tens of meters of water. Somewhere out there, under the Arafura Sea, the Gulf of Carpentaria and the Torres Strait were the true first landfalls, low islands, river deltas, gently sloping plains. Perfect places to land a boat, make a fire, and take stock of whatever this new land had to offer. We can't point to the exact lagoon where they beached their rafts, or the exact sandbar where the first footprints dried in the sun. But we can narrow down the regions. Most models funnel those first crossings into three broad gateways along northern Sahul. One is the arc between what is now Timor and the northern edge of Sahul, a line of approaches that would have led to the drowned plains north of modern Kimberley and Arnhem Land. Another is the corridor from Sulawesi and its neighbours toward what is now the Gulf of Carpentaria. A third lies farther east, through the chain of islands that once stood where the Torres Strait now is, linking New Guinea to the far northeast of the continent. Each of these routes shrinks or stretches depending on exactly how low the sea stood and how people handled currents and winds. Any or all of them could have delivered voyagers to that northern rim, and once they were there, the interior of Sahul opened like a fan. How do we know they didn't just huddle along that drowned coastline for tens of thousands of years before moving inland? We don't completely, but the archaeological trail gives us hints. Dig far inland, in places like the tropical savannas of northern Australia, the semi-arid interior, and even the temperate southeast, and you find something striking. Very old sites, often clustering around dates not too far from one another, on the order of 50,000 to 65,000 years ago. In some caves and rock shelters, stone tools and hearths appear as soon as the sediments become available after local conditions allowed humans in. That pattern suggests that once ashore, people didn't dawdle. They fanned out along rivers, coasts, and upland routes with surprising speed. Archaeologists reconstruct these movements in a kind of slow, patient detective work. They don't have footprints to follow, so they trace the stones instead. Certain kinds of rock make better tools. Fine-grained chert, volcanic glass like obsidian, tough silkrete. These don't lie everywhere. A particular quarry might sit on one headland, one ridge, one outcrop of ancient lava. If you find that same rock with the same microscopic impurities and crystal patterns turning up hundreds of kilometers away in campsites and shelters, you know that ideas and objects and probably people have moved. Across Sahul you see this. Stone from one region turning up in another, patterns of raw material that look like veins of colour radiating from source points. Along some pathways that radiation hugs the estimated old coastlines, marking what were once long beaches, estuaries, and rich mangrove flats. Along others it follows rivers inland, then jumps between basins where short overland crossings would have been possible. Site locations tell a similar story. Early camps cluster where fresh water was predictable, along big river systems near permanent springs, on the margins of lakes that filled and shrank with Ice Age rains. They also appear at ecological crossroads, where forest met open plain, where rocky uplands overlooked floodplains, the sorts of places where a foraging group could keep multiple options open. From these patterns, two broad kinds of early routes emerge. One is coastal. Even when the exact shoreline has been erased, the logic remains. Coasts offer fish, shellfish, stranded marine mammals, nesting birds, and importantly, a long continuous travel corridor. Following a coastline, you rarely lose your bearings. The sea is always on one side. If you carry the boat traditions that brought you from Wallacea, hugging the shore and leapfrogging along estuaries would have been a natural extension of what you already knew. The other type of route runs inland, along rivers and through corridors of permanent water. Australia, even under cooler Ice Age climates, was a continent of extremes. very wet along some fringes, very dry in its heart. To move safely away from the sea, you needed to know where the next drink would come from. Rivers, billabongs, chains of waterholes, these became the skeleton of movement, lines of blue threading through red and yellow land. There's no reason to think it was an either-or choice. Different groups could have favoured different strategies. Some bands might have become coastal specialists, reading tides and reefs. Others may have taken to the interior, tracking the seasons of flowering plants, migrating animals, and filling waterholes. Over generations, marriages, exchanges, and visits between these groups would have knitted the strands together into a continent-spanning web. One of the more surprising conclusions from current evidence is just how fast this web seems to have formed. If the earliest dates for human presence in northern Sahul are somewhere around the mid-60,000s, and if sites thousands of kilometres to the south and east are already occupied by perhaps 50,000 to 45,000 years ago, then people must have crossed the continent in what, on an evolutionary timescale, amounts to the blink of an eye. Not in a single sprint, but in a steady generational wave. Children growing up a little farther along the river than their parents. Teenagers following game into valleys no one in their family has seen. Elders remembering campsites that are now stories told about the old country over the horizon. Some researchers argue for this rapid spread based on simple demographic logic. New land, without other humans to compete with, tends to fill quickly. Birth rates outpace death rates, groups split and bud off, daughters and sons take their skills and stories and establish new camps where the hunting is good and the water is sweet. If there were no rival human species already in Sahul to slow them down, there was little to hold this expansion back except the climate and their own caution. But here again, we have to sit with what we don't know. Most of the coastline that would have hosted the very first camps is underwater. Organic materials, wood, fibres, food remains, decay in tropical soils. Fire, erosion, and later human activity have reworked many of the oldest layers. We may be missing early sites simply because they've been destroyed, deeply buried, or lie beneath the waves. This is what archaeologists call preservation bias. The record we see is not the full story, just the part that happened to survive in conditions kind to stone and charcoal. That bias can make a gradual, complex process look abrupt. It can make a broad wave of settlement look like a handful of rare, isolated sparks. So when we talk about entry regions, dispersal routes, and rapid spread, it's best to imagine them as outlines sketched in charcoal, not as inked lines on a clean map. The general shapes are likely right. Northern landfalls on now drowned plains, movement along coasts and rivers, a relatively swift filling of the habitable zones. The fine details, which valley first, which headland, which exact sequence of camps, are probably gone forever. What remains is the pattern and the principle. Once your ancestors stepped onto Sahul, they began the long, careful work of learning a new continent, one campsite, one waterhole, one path at a time. The next part of their story is about how they found what really mattered in this vast, strange land, the places where, even in hard years, you could still drink, eat, and sleep. If you strip survival down to its quiet fundamentals, the list is short. You need water you can drink, food you can trust, and somewhere to sleep where nothing with teeth can reach you easily. Everything else, stories, art, trade, ceremony, grows out of those three. For the first Australians, stepping into Sahul meant stepping into a pattern of life that their ancestors already knew in broad outline, but had to relearn in every detail. The shapes were familiar. Follow the water, read the plants, listen to the animals. The specifics were utterly new. Finding fresh water came first. Salt water spread out endlessly to the north, glittering and useless to a thirsty mouth. So the search turned inland and downward. On those broad northern plains, rivers would have braided and wandered, leaving behind oxbow lakes, swampy backwaters, and chains of billabongs. Some held water through the dry season, shaded by paperbarks and pandanus. Others baked to cracked clay and dust, death traps for anyone who misjudged the season. Learning the difference was not optional. People watched the sky, the timing of the monsoon, the way clouds built on the horizon. They learned which creeks shrank, but did not vanish, which springs renewed themselves even in lean years. Over time, they would have mapped in memory and in story a network of always water places, soaks hidden under sand, rock holes in escarpments, seeps at the base of hills where groundwater pushed to the surface. Some of this knowledge could be guessed by careful observation. Certain plants, lush sedges, particular figs, pale-barked trees, betrayed moisture beneath. Animal tracks converged on dependable waterholes at dusk and dawn. Birds circled and called in certain patterns over rivers or swamps. Follow the right line of signs, and you would arrive where you needed to be. But a great deal of it had to be earned the hard way by walking, tasting, getting it wrong, and remembering the consequences. A dry camp, a turned-back journey, a child sick from bad water, these were lessons no one forgot. Within a few generations, what had been dangerous guesswork solidified into shared knowledge. Routes between rivers, full-back waterholes, secret springs used only in emergencies. Once water was secured, attention could shift to food. On the coasts and estuaries, the menu was rich, but unfamiliar. Mangrove forests, thick with roots and mud, offered crabs, shellfish, small fish slipping between the pneumatophores. Sandy beaches gave up pipis and cockles to anyone who knew where to dig and what ripples to read. Rocky headlands hid oysters and limpets, and at certain seasons turtles would have hauled themselves up to nest, leaving easily followed tracks in the sand. Out beyond the breakers, fish moved with the tides and seasons. People who had just crossed from Wallacea almost certainly understood some of these patterns already. They'd read reefs and currents before. In Sahul, they simply had to learn new species, new rhythms, when mullet schooled, when sharks were most active, when jellyfish drifted close to shore. Move upriver, and the palette changed. Freshwater fish, eels and turtles lurked in billabongs. Water birds nested on reed beds, their eggs a delicate seasonal prize. In floodplains, the retreating waters left stranded fish in shrinking pools, easy pickings if you arrived before the water stank and the crocodiles claimed the place. Beyond the watercourses lay woodlands and open savannas dotted with fruiting trees, flowering shrubs and grasslands that hid seeds in their heads and tubers in the soil. Here, foraging became a three-dimensional puzzle. Some foods were obvious: bright fruits, sweet nectar, clusters of nuts. Others were buried beneath the surface: yams, lily bulbs, edible roots that looked above ground like any other plant. Still others were technically edible but dangerous unless treated correctly: seeds that needed grinding and roasting, nuts that needed soaking to leach out toxins. In a new land, each of these had to be tested. Careful experiment, a small taste, a wait, another taste, combined with observation of what animals ate safely and what they avoided. Trial and error, but with strong incentives to pass on the successful results and the dire warnings. Hunting added another layer. Kangaroos, wallabies and other macropods moved through these landscapes, following grass growth and water. Emus ranged widely across plains. Smaller animals, bandicoots, possums, lizards, lived in hollows, burrows and thickets, each demanding its own tricks: traps, spears, snares, quick hands. Now fire entered the story in a new way. People arriving in Sahul did not discover fire there. They brought it with them, along with the knowledge that cooked food is safer, more digestible, and easier to chew and share. A fire at night meant warmth, light, and a ring of safety. Predators hesitate at flame. Smoke carries the scent of humans a long way. But quite early in their time on this continent, fire would also have become a way to shape the land itself. Accidental burns, a campfire carried by wind into dry grass, would have shown how quickly fire could run across a savanna. In its wake, the world did not simply turn to ash and silence. Green shoots burst up. Grazing animals gathered along the fresh growth. Certain seeds germinated better. Some trees survived and resprouted. Others died and opened up space. From watching these cycles, people could begin to experiment. A patch burned here, another left untouched there. Fire set at the end of the wet season, when grasses had dried but the soil still held moisture, would burn cooler and patchier than a fire set in the desperate heart of the dry. Small, frequent burns might keep fuel loads low, making catastrophic wildfires less likely. Mosaic burning created a quilt of habitats at different stages of regrowth, each attracting its own set of plants and animals. To us, this looks like landscape management. To them, it was simply a sensible extension of what they already did, using knowledge and timing to increase the chances that next season there would be plenty to eat. Shelter, too, followed the logic of season and resource. In the wet tropics and along monsoonal coasts, heavy rains and storms made high, dry ground precious. Rock overhangs and shallow caves became favoured campsites, especially those with water and good hunting nearby. Archaeological layers in some of these shelters go back tens of thousands of years, suggesting that once found, good refuges were rarely forgotten. Where rock was scarce, shelter could be lighter and more portable. Windbreaks of branches, bark lean toss, sleeping places tucked into the lee of dunes or boulders. In cold uplands and in the temperate south, keeping out the wind and frost mattered more than shedding heat. So camp construction would have shifted accordingly. Thicker bedding, tighter walls, fires banked against chill air. Underlying all of this was movement. These early Australians were not farmers tethered to fields. They were mobile foragers whose territories might span hundreds of kilometres, but who knew them not as abstractions on a map, but as sequences in time. As the wet season swelled rivers and made low country boggy, people might retreat to higher ground, visiting rock shelters and upland hunting grounds. As the dry set in, they could follow shrinking waters downstream, taking advantage of stranded fish and exposed tubers. Some places were visited every year, others were held in reserve for hard times, when usual foods failed or waterholes went bad. This seasonal mobility wasn't random wandering. It was a choreography, tuned to flowering times, migration routes, breeding seasons, and the filling and emptying of lakes. Children grew up walking these circuits, their feet learning the distances between camps, their ears learning the stories attached to each hill, bend and spring. In only a few human lifespans, a scattered set of experiments, which plant to eat, which path to take, which hill gives the best windbreak, hardened into tradition. Deep local knowledge does not require thousands of years to begin. It only requires that each generation listens to the last, adds its own hard-won observations and teaches the children carefully. On a continent the size of Sahul, this process happened again and again in parallel. One group became experts in mangroves and tides, another read the language of desert dunes and spinifex. A third learned the moods of alpine valleys and snow-fed streams. Each solved the same basic puzzle: water, food, shelter, with different pieces suited to their country. And as they did, what had been simply a new land became something more intimate and enduring, a lived-in home memorized down to its waterholes and shade trees, its best camps in a storm, its trusted plants in a famine. If finding water, food and shelter were the basic problems, tools were the way those problems were turned into puzzles that could be solved more reliably. The people who first spread across Sahul did not arrive empty-handed. They brought with them inherited stone traditions and the habit of looking at a landscape and asking, quietly, what here can be turned into something useful? Pick up the right kind of stone, and it behaves almost like frozen water. One sharp blow from just the right angle, and it flakes with a clean, glassy edge. Do this again and again with attention, and you start to get something more than broken rock. You get a cutting surface, a point, a scraper with a curve that fits neatly against the hide of a wallaby or the shaft of a spear. Across early Australian sites, archaeologists find these stone traces, simple flakes, cores from which the flakes were struck, heavier tools for chopping or pounding. They look modest, but hidden in their shapes is a whole chain of decisions. Which stone to choose, how to hold it, how hard to strike, and where, how to repeat a successful pattern, and how to teach someone else to do the same. When we look at these early tool traditions, we're seeing problem-solving preserved in mineral form. A sharp flake makes fingers longer and tougher. It lets you slice meat from bone, open a joint, strip bark, cut a stubborn vine. A scraper turns a clumsy hand into a precise cleaning edge for hides, wood, and plant fibres. A hammerstone amplifies the force of an arm, whether you're cracking nuts, smashing bones for marrow, or shaping another tool. In this way, every tool is an extension of the body. A stone blade is a hard, never-tiring fingernail. A spear is an elongated arm that reaches far beyond normal grasp. A digging stick is a reinforced finger that can pry up yams and roots the bare hands would never reach. And stone was only the visible tip of the technological iceberg. Most of what these people relied on would have been made from things that rot: wood, bark, plant fibres, resins, sinew. Almost none of it survives after tens of thousands of years in the open. But the needs are universal, and the scattered evidence we do have hints at a rich, invisible world of everyday ingenuity. If you want to carry more than your hands can hold, you need containers. Bark can be cut and bent. Fibres can be twisted into cord, then netted or woven into bags. Split cane or flexible branches can be interlaced to form baskets. Each of these steps requires noticing small things: which bark peels cleanly, which fibre doesn't fray when wet, which plants stay flexible after drying. If you want to move many small animals instead of chasing each one, you need traps. Nets set across a creek, loops of cord placed in animal runs, a tangle of branches and stakes that guide fish into narrow spaces where they can be speared or scooped. None of this leaves clear marks on the land after thousands of years, but the logic is hard to escape. In a world where energy spent must be balanced against energy gained, people everywhere have converged on similar solutions. Adhesives are another quiet technology. To fasten stone to wood or wood to wood, you need glue. Certain resins ooze from trees, heated, cleaned of bark and debris, and mixed with ash or other tempering materials. They can be softened in a small ember and pressed into place. When they cool, they harden and hold. A tiny lump of such resin found on an ancient site is not just a curiosity, it is the fossil of an entire chain of experiments with heat and stickiness. Spear systems tell a similar story of gradual refinement. It is one thing to carry a pointed stick and thrust it at close quarters. It is another to shape a straight shaft, balance its weight, fix a carefully knapped stone tip to one end, and perhaps add a wooden or bone barb. It is another step again to design a throwing spear, or even a simple wooden thrower, an extra lever that sits in the hand and lets the arm store and release more energy, sending a spear farther and faster than bare muscle could manage. We cannot say exactly when each of these innovations appeared in Sahul. The record is patchy, and wood does not last, but by the time of the earliest well-dated sites, people were already using spears effectively enough to make a living in landscapes full of wary, fast-moving animals. Whether by stalking and ambush, driving game toward narrow defiles, or waiting at waterholes where paths converged, they were applying thought to distance and timing, and letting their tools carry some of the burden. What matters for our story is not any single invention, but the way small changes accumulate. A stone point that is slightly better balanced means more reliable hunting. A stronger cord means a net that can be used more times before it fails. A more efficient way of binding a spear tip means fewer hours spent in camp repairing gear, and more hours spent gathering or resting. Each improvement is tiny, almost invisible at the scale of a day. At the scale of generations, they add up to resilience. With better cutting tools, more foods become usable, tough roots that can be sliced thin and roasted, animals that once yielded only their easiest meat now give up every scrap. With more reliable containers, people can carry water from a distant spring or take a surplus harvest of seeds back to a favoured shelter. With stronger spears and cleverer hunting strategies, the risk of returning to camp empty-handed decreases, even in lean years. None of this would have felt dramatic to the people living it. A new way of binding a basket, a better choice of timber for spear shafts, a slightly altered pattern of knots in a fishing net. These were the quiet adjustments of daily life. They were shared around the fire, copied, tested, and kept if they worked. Over thousands of years, that patient tinkering turned a strange continent into a deeply known one. Tools did not just help people survive in Sahul. They allowed them to tune themselves to its rhythms so closely that the line between body, tool, and country blurred into a single practiced way of living. All of this ingenuity was being tested against a background that rarely sat still. When people first spread across Sahul, the world was in the grip of the Ice Age. Australia itself was never buried under great ice sheets, the way northern Europe was, but it was plugged into the same global system. When ice built up on the poles, sea levels fell, temperatures dropped, and the belts of rain that circle the planet shifted north and south like a slow, restless tide. To live here was to feel those distant movements in very local ways. Some pulses were gentle, the kind of change that a long life could watch unfold. A few cooler, drier decades in a row, lakes shrinking at the edges, sand dunes creeping a little farther each year, grasslands that once stayed green into the hot season browning early, forcing animals to move on sooner than expected. Other pulses were sharper, a run of failed wet seasons, winds scouring the interior and lifting dust into the sky, soils, thin to begin with on this very old continent, stripping away and leaving bare, hard crust behind. In these times, habitats didn't just fade, they snapped. A chain of waterholes along a creek became a string of dry pans. A patch of woodland that had sheltered birds and small mammals for generations could, within a few years, thin into open, thirsty country. Then, thousands of years later, the pattern might swing back. Temperatures eased, the monsoon pushed further inland. Dry basins filled again, at first with seasonal marshes, then with standing lakes that drew in birds, fish, and people from long distances. Where dunes had marched, grasses returned, pinning sand in place and offering new grazing for kangaroos and other game. From high above, if we could compress time and watch, Sahul would look like a breathing organism, wet fingers of forest and river spreading out, then curling back, patches of rich habitat appearing like glowing islands in a sea of harsher ground, then fading and flaring elsewhere. For the people inside that system, survival meant learning to read its small early signals. A family group could not wait until a lake vanished completely before changing their patterns. They would have paid attention to the way reeds grew thinner at the margins, the way fish runs shortened, the way certain birds stopped arriving on their usual dates. The country itself would whisper the coming changes, if you listened closely enough. So people learned to map, not just in space, but in time. They knew where the big rivers ran and where their courses narrowed into dependable chains of waterholes that might last long into the dry. They knew where springs broke through limestone or ancient sandstone, cool water welling up from the depths even when the surface world was parched. They paid attention to rock shelters that stayed shaded and cool, south-facing slopes that held dew longer, patches of heavier soil that kept green things alive weeks beyond their neighbours. These were micro-environments, tiny refuges in a vast, fluctuating landscape. To outsiders, the desert might look like one continuous emptiness. To those who walked it throughout an ice age, it was a mosaic of gradients and exceptions. A patch of mulga woodland that dropped seeds after rare rains. A bend in a river where fish gathered in deeper, shaded pools. A rocky outcrop that trapped a little extra runoff in its crevices. Each of these features could be the difference between a lean season and a fatal one. And these places did not stand alone. People stitched them together in memory into longer journeys. River corridors that could be followed for weeks, switching from one refuge to the next. Cross-country routes that hopped from spring to soak to shaded gorge, like beads on a string. Clothing and shelter were the immediate bodily interface with this climate. In the cooler, more southerly parts of Sahul, and at higher elevations, nights during glacial peaks must have bit deeply. It is unlikely that people walked those winters naked and unprotected. Animal skins, scraped with stone tools, softened with fat and repeated working, could be wrapped and tied. Possum, kangaroo, wallaby, each hide a layer of insulation against cold wind. Fur and plant fibres might be combined, spun into cords, plaited into belts or simple coverings. Further north, in the monsoon tropics, the challenge was often the opposite. Protection from sudden drenching rains, from biting insects, from the cooling chill that follows a storm. Cloaks could still help here, as could simple capes of bark or woven leaves, quickly made and easily discarded when no longer needed. Shelters showed a similar spectrum of adaptation. Sometimes nothing more was required than a rock overhang and a fire, smoke curling out into the open night. Elsewhere, simple frameworks of branches could be leaned and tied together, then thatched with grass, bark, or leafy boughs to shed rain and break the wind. In some regions, semi-permanent huts might be built and revisited seasonally, repaired and used again when the right foods ripened. Camp organisation was part of this climatic dance. A good camp wasn't just anywhere you could unroll a sleeping place. It was chosen with careful thought, slightly above flood level, but close enough to water that daily trips didn't exhaust you, near a stand of useful trees but not so deep in the thicket that you couldn't see approaching animals, oriented so that prevailing winds carried smoke away and morning sun reached cold bodies early. Within the camp, where fires were laid, where food was processed, where sharp stone was worked, and where people slept would have been shaped by unspoken rules. Keep embers where they can be shielded if a storm blows through. Store dry wood and spare spear shafts where rising damp or a sudden downpour can't reach them. Place grindstones, baskets of seeds, and other heavy tools in spots that will be safe, even if the group has to leave quickly and return later. In such a volatile world, risk management became almost a way of thinking. You rarely relied on just one source of anything. If a certain kind of yam was abundant, you enjoyed it, but you also kept in mind the locations of other roots, seeds, and hunting grounds. If one waterhole was full, you still remembered the next two along the line, and whether they tended to last longer into bad years. Food sharing was part of this strategy, not just kindness. When a hunting party succeeded, meat could be more than immediate calorie intake. It was an investment. Sharing widely meant that on the day your spear missed or the animals changed their path, others were more likely to share back. Over time, this created a web of mutual obligation that smoothed out the jagged peaks and valleys of chance. Redundancy appeared not only in food sources, but in skills. Children didn't learn only one way to find water, one way to make fire, one song that marked the path to a distant spring. They learned variations, alternatives, special techniques passed down with quiet emphasis, the plants that signal hidden moisture, the behavior of certain birds that reveals a soak, the dry sticks that will still take a spark after rain. This layering of knowledge meant that when one method failed under unusual conditions, another might still work. Underneath all of this was an invisible architecture of social networks. In a stable, predictable climate, a small, isolated group might manage on its own. In Ice Age Sahul, isolation was risky. If your local river failed, and you had no ties to people beyond it, your options narrowed brutally. But if your grandparents had maintained exchange relationships with groups over the range, if marriage partners had moved between distant camps, if songs and stories carried the locations of far-off refuges, then a bad patch in one area did not have to be the end. Gifts and visits, shared ceremonies, arranged marriages and trading of stone, ochre, and other valued materials were not just social niceties. They were a climate adaptation. They kept information flowing where the rains had fallen this year, which valley still held game, which path was safe, and which had been burned or flooded. They ensured that in times of local scarcity, a group might have somewhere to go where they were not strangers. In this way, climate volatility and social connectivity became two sides of the same story. The more the sky and the seasons wavered, the more important it was to have dependable lines of connection between people. The harshness of the Ice Age did not simply toughen individuals, it selected for cultures that valued memory, generosity, and wide horizons. Those networks, shaped by the wind and the shifting rains, would soon be tested by another challenge entirely: the presence of animals unlike any the world would ever see again, the giants of Sahul that shared the continent with its first human inhabitants. When people first walked into Sahul, they did not step into an empty stage. They entered a continent already crowded with other stories, written in bone and muscle on a scale that's hard to imagine now. Some of the locals were familiar in outline, but exaggerated, as if someone had taken the animals you might recognize from modern Australia and turned the volume up. There were kangaroos that didn't hop the way we think of kangaroos. Some, like Procoptodon, stood taller than a man, with flat faces and powerful forelimbs, likely more walkers and striders than leapers, moving through open country like heavy, two-legged browsers. There were giant wallabies, giant short-faced kangaroos, whole guilds of grazing and browsing marsupials, filling every niche the grasslands and woodlands could offer. There were wombats scaled into something very different, Diprotodon, a slow, lumbering browser the size of a small car, perhaps 2-3 tons of fur and bone, big enough that a whole family group of people could have walked in its shadow. Predators, too, had grown large in this isolated evolutionary workshop. Thylacoleo, the so-called marsupial lion, carried bone-crushing jaws and long blade-like teeth in a compact muscular body. It wasn't a lion, not in the cat sense, but it probably occupied a similar ecological role, climbing, ambushing, dragging down prey with a power that would have made it a creature to be respected, feared, and carefully watched. Then there were the giant reptiles and birds, enormous monitor lizards, close relatives of the Komodo dragon, prowled some regions, capable of preying on mammals and people alike. Towering flightless birds, Genyornis and its kin, strode across open plains, their heavy legs and big bodies built for running rather than flying. This was the world the first Australians entered, a mosaic of enormous, slow reproducing animals, many of them specialized for the relatively stable, though fluctuating climates of earlier Ice Age cycles. For a time, people and giants coexisted. We know this because their remains overlap in the archaeological and fossil record. In some places, layers of sediment show megafauna bones and human artifacts lying within the same broad windows of time. In others, the last dates for certain giants and the first secure dates for people come tantalizingly close, separated by only a few thousand years or less. But as millennia passed, something changed. By around 40 or 50,000 years ago, depending on the region, many of these large animals were gone. Not all at once, not everywhere in lockstep, but the pattern is clear. The biggest bodied species thinned out and disappeared, leaving behind a smaller, more cautious fauna. Why, here, we move from solid ground into a landscape of hypotheses. One line of thinking emphasizes climate. The Ice Age was not a single uniform freeze, but a sequence of pulses. Around the time people spread through Sahul, the climate system was moving toward a particularly intense dry peak. Rain belts shifted, inland water shrank, and the patchwork of rich habitats that had supported big, slow-breeding animals frayed at the edges. Under this view, megafauna populations were already stressed, living on the limits of what the land could support. Even without humans, their future might have been uncertain. Another line of thinking emphasizes people themselves. Large animals with little or no prior experience of clever tool-using predators can be vulnerable. They often lack the instinctive fear of upright bipeds that animals in more heavily hunted continents develop over long periods. A relatively small number of skilled hunters, coordinating in groups with spears and fire and knowledge of animal movements, might have tipped the balance quickly, especially if they focused on prime adults or key breeding grounds. Between those two poles lies a spectrum of combined scenarios, and that is where many researchers now place their bets. Climate and humans acting together, each amplifying the other's effects. What would unambiguous evidence of human hunting look like? In a perfect world, we would find a diprotodon skeleton with a stone spear point still embedded in a rib. We would uncover kill sites with piles of megafauna bones, cut marked where muscles were stripped away, associated with hearths and discarded tools. We do see hints, bones with possible cut marks, burnt eggshell fragments from giant birds that appear in human-occupied layers, patterns of megafauna remains found close to camp debris. But time is a ruthless editor. Most carcasses never fossilize at all. Of those that do, many are scattered, trampled, dissolved or eroded before archaeologists ever see them. Cut marks can be faint, easily mimicked by natural processes. Stone spear points are durable, but they move, reused, resharpened, carried away from where an animal fell. On top of this, Sahul's most important human sites and megafauna deposits are often not the same places. People liked caves and rock shelters for living. Big animals might have died in open plains, around lake margins, or in now buried river systems. Matching them up in time and space is like trying to reconstruct a play when most of the actors have left the stage and taken their costumes with them. So researchers also look for indirect signatures, the shadows cast by human presence. Fire is one of the clearest. Charcoal in lake sediments can tell us how often the surrounding country burned. Pollen grains preserved in the same mud record which plants were growing there. In some regions there appears to be a shift around the time of human arrival. Fire becomes more frequent or more regular, and the vegetation changes from denser woodlands toward more open fire-tolerant mosaics. This doesn't necessarily mean people were burning recklessly. Patchy, deliberate fire can be a powerful tool. It can promote fresh grass for game animals, encourage certain food plants, clear travel routes, and reduce the risk of catastrophic wildfires by consuming fuel in controlled doses. But for large animals that depended on older, unburnt habitats, thick scrub, tall forests, specific wetland margins, these new fire regimes could have quietly eroded their refuges. A little less cover each decade, fewer safe places to shelter young, less resilience when a bad run of dry years hit. Competition is another subtle pressure. People weren't just hunters, they were omnivores with flexible diets. They dug roots, harvested seeds, gathered fruits, took eggs, and perhaps, in some circumstances, defended key resources, waterholes, rich patches of vegetation, from other large animals. Even if direct hunting of megafauna was rare, steadily diverting food and water, or disturbing breeding grounds, could have pushed already stressed populations below the threshold where they could recover from droughts or disease. None of this points to a single simple story. Different species almost certainly declined for different mixtures of reasons, in different places at different times. A giant bird that laid its eggs in open ground might have been especially vulnerable to growing numbers of curious, hungry humans. A massive herbivore dependent on large, continuous tracts of particular vegetation might have been slowly squeezed by a drying climate and changing fire. A top predator could have faded as its prey base shrank, perhaps hanging on longest in remote refuges we have yet to find. From a great distance in time, it is tempting to look for a verdict: people guilty or climate innocent, climate guilty, people innocent. The reality on the ground was probably more tangled. A continent in flux, giant animals already walking a narrow ecological path, and a new kind of primate arriving with fire, tools, stories, and a talent for adaptation. For the first Australians themselves, these giants were not scientific problems, but neighbours and forces in their world, dangerous, useful, awe-inspiring. Some they may have hunted, others they may have mostly avoided. All of them, in one way or another, would have shaped how people moved, where they camped, and how they thought about the country. Even as the largest bodies vanished from the landscape, their presence did not entirely disappear. It lingered in bones buried in ancient sediments, in shifted plant communities, and perhaps most enduringly in the deep memory of stories. Those stories, carried in song and narrative across tens of thousands of years, may still echo faintly in Aboriginal traditions today, echoes we turn to next when we follow the songlines that thread through this long shared history. When people talk about ancient Australia, they often reach first for fossils, stone tools, and radiocarbon dates. But for this continent, there is another archive of the past, one that doesn't sit in museum drawers or lab freezers. It walks around, breathes, remembers, and keeps updating itself. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander knowledge systems. It's easy, from a Western scientific perspective, to slip into thinking of these systems as data sources, as if a story were just a coded report about a flood or a strange animal or a star pattern. That way of seeing things is tempting, because sometimes, when you look closely, you do find remarkable correspondences between stories and events we can date in geological time. But if we reduce them to that, we miss almost everything important. For First Nations peoples, these are not dusty legends. They're living lore, living relationships with country, renewed every time a song is sung, a ceremony is held, a story is told in the right place, to the right people, at the right time. They are not about the land in an abstract sense. They are one of the ways the land speaks, through people. Across Australia, different language groups have different traditions, different song cycles, different names and responsibilities. There is no single, simple Aboriginal story of the past. There are thousands of distinct strands, crossing and looping, sometimes sharing motifs, sometimes diverging entirely, each belonging to its own country and its own custodians. One thread that appears in many regions is the idea of songlines. You can think of a songline very crudely as a route across the landscape traced by ancestral beings in the beginning times, what many groups call the dreaming, or dream time. But that English word dream misleads. The dreaming is not just fantasy or memory. It is a time outside time, always present, in which the foundational acts that shaped country are both long ago and ongoing. A songline is a path through that story world, and also a path you can walk with your feet. The verses of a song can describe the order of waterholes, the shape of a ridge, the turn of a river, the place where the soil changes colour. They can encode who has rights and responsibilities at each location, which plants can be taken, which animals should be left alone, where to find shelter in bad weather, where to be extremely careful. In a landscape where maps are not made of paper, they are made of melody and rhythm and carefully chosen words. If you know the song and you have been properly taught, you can travel huge distances, remembering each landmark by its place in the music. You can hand that knowledge on to your children, not in the form of abstract instructions, but as something beautiful, memorable, and saturated with meaning. Law and survival are not separate categories here. To follow the law is to look after water, animals, fire, and people. To know the story of a hill or a creek is to understand what it can provide, what it has endured in the past, what it expects of you now. Over long spans of time, these oral traditions can act like braided rivers of memory. Many Aboriginal groups, for example, maintain stories about coastlines that once lay far out from today's shore, now drowned beneath the sea. In some cases, the narratives describe dry land, where there is only open water today, or islands that no longer exist, or bays that used to be plains. When geologists model sea level rise after the last ice age, some of those story elements line up intriguingly with what the coastlines would have looked like 10 or even more thousands of years ago. Other traditions speak of volcanic eruptions, of mountains that were once fire-spitting, of ground that shook and split. In a few regions, dates for those eruptions match the estimated age of the stories, suggesting that collective memory can carry impressions of extraordinary events much further than we might assume. None of this means that every story can be translated into a neat scientific label. This stanza equals that eruption. This character equals that extinct animal. Stories are not puzzles for outsiders to solve. They operate on many levels at once: spiritual, ethical, practical, historical. Trying to peel away only the useful facts is like stripping bark off a living tree to get at the wood inside. You might learn something, but you also do damage. There are also clear, important limits. In many communities, some knowledge is restricted: men's business, women's business, knowledge for certain age groups or for certain kin relationships. Some stories are only told at specific times of year, or in specific places, or in the context of ceremony. Some are not meant to be written down or recorded at all. From the outside, it can be tempting to ask, what do your stories say about megafauna? About sea level rise, about the first arrival of people? But custodians are under no obligation to answer, and no one has the right to mine their traditions for information. Respect means recognizing that refusal, silence, or partial sharing can be forms of care. Care for country, care for law, care for ancestors and descendants. Where collaboration does happen, it can be extraordinarily powerful. In some regions, elders have worked with archaeologists, linguists, and geologists to align oral histories with physical traces on the ground. A story about a long-ago flood might send a research team looking in a particular valley, where they then find lake sediments recording a sudden rise in water. A narrative about an old campsite might help locate artifact scatters or rock shelters hidden under vegetation. Story names for stars can guide astronomical research into traditional navigation and seasonal calendars. In the best cases, this is not a one-way extraction of information from Indigenous people into Western science. It is a conversation between different ways of knowing, each with its own methods, strengths, and boundaries. Elders sometimes say that their people have been here since the beginning or since time began. From a strict scientific perspective, we might talk instead about 50 or 60,000 years of human presence in Australia, as far back as our current dating methods allow. But those are just two languages trying to point toward the same vast stretch of belonging. Deep time in this context is not just a number of years. It is a continuous relationship, a sense that the hills, rivers, and stars know you, and you know them, because your ancestors walked with them, sang to them, cared for them, generation after generation through ice ages, sea level changes, and the disappearance of giants. As you drift toward sleep, You might imagine those first Australians not merely as figures in a distant past, but as the early chapters of stories still being told. Their descendants are here, now speaking many languages, holding on to law and country in the face of enormous change. The land remembers them in its sediments and fossils. They remember the land in song, ceremony, and story, and through careful, respectful listening to both, we can begin to sense how a human memory might stretch, unbroken, across tens of thousands of years. From those sung paths that cross deserts and mountains, we turn next to another kind of enduring mark, images fixed on stone, where some of the continent's first creative worlds still look back at us from the rock. Across Australia, there are places where the stone itself seems to have been used as a kind of skin for the world's stories. Rock shelters, overhangs, open cliff faces. Some look out over wide river valleys. Others hide in tangled gorges or face quiet billabongs. In many of these places, the rock carries layers of pigment and engraving laid down over thousands of years. We give them simple labels: Kimberley Rock Art, Arnhem Land Rock Shelters, Cape York Galleries, the Pilbara, the Burrup Peninsula, the Grampians, the Flinders Ranges. Each of these broad regions holds its own traditions, its own sequences of style, its own meanings for the people whose country it is. From a distance, outsiders often talk as if Australian rock art were one unified thing. Up close, it is anything but. In the Kimberley, in the far northwest, there are delicate figures that archaeologists call guion or Bradshaw paintings. Slender human forms, often with elaborate headdresses, tassels and objects that might be bags, spears or ceremonial items. In eastern Arnhem Land, there are bold X-ray style images where animals and humans are shown with bones, organs and inner details visible, as if the painter had peeled back the skin. In other regions there are deep pecked engravings of circles, tracks and geometric patterns, sometimes so weathered that only shadows at a certain angle bring them out. For the communities who belong to these places, the images are part of living lore and story. Some can be spoken about publicly, others are restricted, some are known to be very old, others were made in the memory of grandparents and great-grandparents. From a scientific point of view, one of the first questions people ask is, how old are these pictures? That turns out to be remarkably hard to answer. Paint itself can rarely be dated directly. Pigments are often made from iron-rich ochres or other minerals that don't contain the organic material needed for radiocarbon tests. Weathering strips away layers, water runs down the rock, carrying tiny fragments with it. Sometimes the only way to estimate an age is to date something that sits over or under the art. A wasp nest built on top of a figure, a fragment of ancient mud wasp casing beneath it, a mineral crust that formed after the painting was made. Researchers work carefully, almost cautiously, around these pieces of evidence. A wasp nest overlying a painted line might yield a radiocarbon date of, say, 12,000 years ago. That tells us the painting beneath must be older than that nest. A wasp nest buried beneath a pigment layer might give a minimum age in the other direction. The art must be younger than this. With enough pieces like this, from enough sites, patterns begin to emerge. Older styles tend to cluster in deeper shelter ceilings. Newer ones occur nearer the entrances or at lower levels. At best, it's a patchwork of constraints and probabilities, stitched together with geology, chemistry, and a lot of patience. Because of this, researchers are wary of grand claims. There are strong indications that some Australian rock art traditions reach back tens of thousands of years, possibly to near the time of first known human presence on the continent. But for many individual images, the honest answer is, we don't know the exact age. We can place them in a relative sequence. We can say this style tends to be older than that style. This layer sits underneath that one. Precision beyond that often remains out of reach. Yet even without perfect dates, the images themselves give us a window into changing worlds. In many shelters, you can see superimposition, one figure painted over another, and then another again. A wall becomes a palimpsest of generations. Animals are especially common: fish, turtles, kangaroos, wallabies, crocodiles, birds, sometimes creatures that may match now extinct species, though claims about megafauna pictures need to be treated with care. Human figures appear in many guises. Some look like hunters carrying spears and boomerangs. Some seem to be dancing or taking part in ceremony. Others are more abstracted, stick-like forms, or just hands pressed against the rock, ringed with sprayed pigment that leaves a negative silhouette. Then there are marks that don't immediately resolve into familiar shapes: circles joined by lines, clusters of dots, repeated geometric patterns, grids, crescents, parallel bars. In Western terms, we might be tempted to call them abstract. But to the people who made them, they would have been anything but. What did all this mean? Here, the story becomes more speculative, and it's important to tread lightly. For some images, contemporary custodians can explain the significance. Certain figures might be connected with particular ancestral beings, or with specific ceremonies, or with lore about animals and country. Certain motifs can act as identifiers for clans, language groups, or ritual responsibilities. In living traditions, rock art can be visited as part of initiation, teaching, or seasonal observances. The surface is not just a picture, it is a meeting place between story, people, and landscape. For images whose specific meanings have not been passed on, we can only suggest possibilities based on what we know about how humans use imagery in other contexts. Art can be a form of memory, a way of fixing an important event, a journey, a teaching story in a place where it will not be forgotten. It can be identity, making visible the presence of a group, its totems, its ancestors, its particular link to this creek or hill or shelter. It can be teaching, showing which animals live here, how they look in different seasons, where their inner parts lie for butchering, what tracks they leave. Some images may have been part of ceremony, made or renewed during rituals that tied people to ancestors and to country. Others may work as a kind of map, not in the Western sense of a bird's-eye diagram, but as a sequence of marks that correspond to places, waterholes, paths, dangers, rights and obligations. And for the makers themselves, the act of painting and engraving might have had its own quiet power. The feel of ochre between fingers, the time taken to trace out a form already long familiar in the mind, the knowledge that what you are doing links you to those who came before and those who will come after. When we step back and think about survival over tens of thousands of years, it can be tempting to focus only on tools and technology, spear points, grindstones, hearths. But creativity is a survival tool too. Rock art, like Songlines, is a way of compressing information and meaning into forms that can travel across generations. A child learning to recognize a painted fish in a shelter is not just learning fish. They may be learning a complex web of associations. When this fish appears, which wines are blowing, which plants are fruiting, what ceremonies are due, who has the right to harvest, how to cut and cook it, which stories are told at the waterhole where it is found. Images build belonging. They tell you, you are part of this place, part of this story, marked into the stone alongside your ancestors. For the first Australians, living through shifting climates, moving coastlines, and the slow disappearance of giant animals, that kind of shared meaning was not a luxury. It was one of the ways a scattered population turned into enduring cultures, capable of adapting together. From these painted and engraved worlds we turn next to another kind of trace, the bones, teeth, and campfires that let science glimpse individual lives and the deep time they inhabited. In some of those same shelters, beneath the painted ceilings and beside the old hearths, there are other traces. A fragment of jaw, stained dark by minerals, a vertebra, its surfaces smoothed by time. A burial where the soil has settled just slightly differently, telling you, if you know how to look, that someone was carefully placed there long ago. For Aboriginal communities, these are not specimens. They are ancestors, people with kin with names that may still be remembered in story, with continuing relationships to country. For scientists invited to study them, they are also tiny archives of information about how those ancestors lived. Bones carry stories of health written in their shape. Healed fractures show that someone fell, or fought, or was injured in a hunt, and then lived long enough for the bone to knit, which implies care and support. Arthritic joints speak of years of walking, carrying, working, throwing. Worn knees and ankles tell of people moving long distances over uneven ground. The pattern of muscle attachments on bone can show which limbs were used most, how often, and in what kinds of movement. Teeth are another record, especially of childhood. Fine lines in the enamel, invisible to the naked eye, can mark episodes of illness or nutritional stress when growth briefly faltered. Heavy tooth wear suggests a diet that included hard seeds, gritty tubers or foods ground on sandstone, with tiny particles of stone getting into every mouthful. In some skeletons, particular teeth are chipped in consistent ways, hinting that people used them as an extra hand, gripping hides, fibres or plant stems between their incisors as they worked. Together, these clues sketch a life lived in motion, hunting, gathering, carrying, climbing, sitting by fires, chewing tough foods that required strong jaws and steady effort. From time to time, a burial offers a different kind of information: position, grave goods, traces of ochre on bones. When someone is laid to rest with care, knees drawn up, hands placed in a particular way, red ochre sprinkled over the body, we glimpse emotional worlds that go beyond bare survival. Grief, respect, obligations to the dead, the existence of ritual. In the last few decades, new techniques have added other layers to this picture. Genetics, spoken about in simple terms, is essentially the study of how tiny variations in DNA are shared, spread, and shuffled between people over time. When communities agree, and when conditions are right, fragments of ancient DNA can sometimes be recovered from bones or teeth, especially in cooler, drier regions. These genetic signatures can hint at broad patterns, that people in one part of Australia have been linked to that region for tens of thousands of years, that groups on distant coasts share an old connection, that Australia's first peoples descend from lineages separate from those of later arrivals elsewhere. But genetics has limits, and they are important to remember. DNA rarely survives well in hot, wet environments, which means huge parts of the continent may never yield usable sequences. Even where it does survive, samples are few, and each one represents just a single individual, a single moment. From such sparse data, sweeping claims about the first Australians risk outrunning the evidence. Genetics can suggest relationships and movements. It cannot on its own tell us what those journeys meant, or how people understood them. Another window comes from the chemistry locked inside teeth and bones. Isotopes, slightly different forms of common elements like carbon, nitrogen, strontium, and oxygen, vary from place to place and from one kind of food to another. Plants growing in coastal dunes, freshwater swamps, or inland grasslands take up distinct mixtures of these isotopes. Animals eating those plants inherit those signatures. So do the humans who eat the animals and plants by measuring isotopes in tooth enamel, which forms in childhood and then stays mostly unchanged. Researchers can infer something about the landscapes and foods that shaped a person's early years. Was this child growing up near the sea, with a diet rich in marine foods, or inland, with more emphasis on terrestrial animals and seeds? Bone, which turns over more slowly, gives a blurred record of the last years of adult life, a weighted average of meals, seasons, and movements. None of this is precise enough to say, this individual walked from here to here on this date. But it can show, for example, that a person buried far inland has a childhood isotope signature from the coast, suggesting that they or their parents moved across country during life. It can hint at flexible seasonal rounds, people shifting between river plains, uplands and shores in response to climate, rainfall and tradition. Underneath all these techniques lies a more fundamental question: who has the right to ask and to answer? In Australia, the long history of colonial collecting, of remains taken without consent, stored in museums, shipped overseas, has left deep wounds. For decades now, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities have been working to bring ancestors home, to rebury them according to law and custom. Modern research, when it happens at all, is increasingly shaped by that reality. Consent is not a formality, it is the foundation. Traditional owners decide whether ancestral remains may be examined, how and for what purposes. Some communities choose detailed analysis, others prefer minimal disturbance or none at all. Repatriation, ceremony, and the ongoing relationship between living people and their dead take precedence over scientific curiosity. Within those boundaries, when work proceeds, it becomes a careful collaboration. Archaeologists bring dating methods, skeletal analysis, isotope measurements. Geneticists, when invited, bring tools for reading ancient DNA. Elders bring knowledge of country, songs, stories, place names and responsibilities that frame what those scientific signals might mean. Oral traditions may identify a burial place as associated with particular ancestral beings, or with an old shoreline, or with known pathways of movement. When all these strands are woven together, bones and teeth, isotopes and genes, charcoal from ancient hearths, sediment layers, rock art sequences, and living cultural knowledge, the guesswork shrinks, and the possibilities become more grounded. Instead of a single fragile line of evidence, there is a net. If several different methods approached with care and guided by community understanding point toward the same conclusion, long continuity in a region, or a shift in diet at a certain time, or connections between distant places, we can say, quietly and with some confidence, that we are catching a real pattern. The remains themselves stay few, scattered across a vast continent and a deep stretch of time. Yet from them, and from the stories that surround them, we begin to see individuals emerging from the abstract, not just first arrivals, but people who grew up, walked, worked, loved, fell ill, healed or did not, and finally returned to the earth. From those particular lives, science and story together lead us onward, to the changing world they inhabited as sea levels rose, coasts shifted, and whole parts of their map slipped beneath the waves. When the first people reached Sahul, the world's oceans were much lower than they are now. So much water was locked up in ice at the poles and in mounting glaciers that the coastline lay far out from today's shores. What is now the shallow seafloor of the Arafura Sea was then dry land. The Gulf of Carpentaria held a great lake. Tasmania was joined to the mainland by plains and low hills. The edge of the continent was not a narrow strip of beach, but an immense fringe of mangroves, estuaries, river mouths, dune fields and bays that no one alive has ever seen. If you could draw their map, it would look familiar in the middle and utterly strange at the edges. The Kimberley, Arnhem Land, Cape York, the Great Australian Bight, all recognisable. But beyond them, out where the ocean lies now, there would be more of everything. More rivers, more lagoons, more rocky headlands, more reefs reachable on foot at low tide. For tens of thousands of years, people lived on that vanished fringe. They camped beside rivers that no longer exist, drank from springs that now bubble in darkness, walked along shorelines now hundreds of kilometres offshore. They hunted wallabies and kangaroos across plains that have been drowned for so long that only fishes know their shape. They collected shellfish and crabs, gathered edible plants in salt marshes, watched the tides and the winds and the behaviour of birds to read the sea. Then slowly at first the ice began to melt. From the peak of the last ice age, around 20,000 years ago, global temperatures rose, not in a single smooth curve, but in pulses and pauses, steps up and brief plateaus. Each pulse of warmth sent more water coursing from glaciers into rivers, then into the ocean. The sea crept higher, year by year, generation by generation. For any one person, the change would have been almost invisible. The high tide licking a little further up the beach, a favourite fishing rock becoming harder to reach at certain times of the moon. A freshwater spring near the shoreline turning brackish, then salty. But over centuries the difference was profound. Low-lying plains became marshes, then shallow bays. River mouths shifted inland. Sand dunes that had sheltered camps were undercut and washed away. Trees that had stood for hundreds of years died with their roots in salt water and collapsed into the waves. Places that had been central to a community's life, reliable fishing grounds, sacred rocks, burial sites, found themselves on a coast that would not stay still. As the shoreline retreated landward, people moved with it. Seasonal routes adjusted. A path that used to follow the edge of a bay might now circle a growing lagoon. Camps were rebuilt on slightly higher ground, then higher still. Inland waterholes and river crossings became more important. Some groups may have shifted their emphasis from coastal foods to riverine or upland resources when the sea advanced too far, then returned to the new shore once it stabilized for a time. Elsewhere, narrowing land bridges pinched off completely. The shallow connection between Tasmania and the mainland flooded, turning familiar hills into islands, then a single large island. Across what is now Torres Strait, the broad Sahul plain was eaten away by rising water until New Guinea and Australia stood apart. Communities whose country had once been continuous found themselves separated by channels that could no longer be waded or paddled in a casual crossing. These transformations did more than change where people walked. They altered how whole landscapes worked. Fish that had spawned in estuaries were pushed up rivers or out to sea as salinity patterns shifted. Mangroves marched inland. Freshwater swamps shrank or disappeared. Animals that had roamed open grasslands now found themselves squeezed into narrower strips of suitable habitat. Fire regimes, plant communities, the timing of seasonal abundance, all of it was repatterned by the advancing sea. For archaeologists, this creates a peculiar problem. Much of the evidence for the earliest coastal life in Australia is now underwater. Campsites that once lay a few metres above the tide are buried under metres of sediment on the seabed. Hearths are scattered by waves. Delicate artefacts of wood, fibre and bone that might have survived in dry caves have long since decayed in salt water. Underwater archaeology is possible, but it is difficult. To find a submerged site, you first have to know where to look. Researchers use sonar to map the seafloor, searching for drowned river channels and terraces where people might once have lived. They take cores of sediment to look for traces of charcoal, pollen and shell fragments that hint at old shorelines. Divers and remotely operated vehicles can sometimes examine promising spots directly, but the work is slow, expensive and constrained by depth, visibility, currents, and the challenge of working with fragile deposits in a moving medium. A few submerged sites have begun to appear around Australia, places where stone tools or other clear signs of human activity now lie below the waves. They are tantalizing glimpses of a much larger story that remains hidden. For every site we can see on land, there may be another or several others drowned just beyond the modern coast. Yet even if the camps and hearths have gone, their absence has a meaning of its own. It reminds us that the people whose lives we are tracing were not living in a static world. They experienced shorelines that moved, rivers that changed course, familiar resources that shifted their locations or vanished. They watched the sea take pieces of their country and keep going. How do communities respond when the map they know disappears beneath water? One response is practical. You move. You learn new places. You find new fishing spots, new freshwater sources, new plant foods. Children grow up knowing the new shoreline as normal, with only the older ones remembering where the coast used to be. Another response is cultural. Stories begin to hold the memory of drowned lands, tales of canoes paddling where people once walked, ancestral beings crossing dry ground in places now deep underwater. In many Aboriginal traditions, there are narratives that seem to recall rising seas, coastlines flooding, islands separating from the mainland. Whether or not each specific story describes a particular event, the pattern is clear. Environmental upheaval is folded into lore, song, and story. This is one way resilience works. The physical world changes, sometimes slowly, sometimes abruptly, but knowledge systems are flexible enough to absorb those changes, to guide people in adapting without losing their sense of who they are or where they belong. Ceremonies shift to new sites. Sacred responsibilities move with the living land, not with fixed coordinates on a vanished shore. The sea's advance after the Ice Age was not the first great environmental transformation Aboriginal ancestors had lived through. It would not be the last. Their survival did not depend on holding the world still, but on reading its movements and responding with care, creativity, and continuity. Out there beyond the breakers lie the ghost coasts of ancient Australia, the first beaches, the first estuaries, the lost camps of people who watched the waves come closer. On land, their descendants stayed with country as it changed, wove those changes into story, and maintained networks that could stretch across thousands of kilometres even as the shape of the continent itself was rewritten by the sea. Those networks are the quiet thread running through everything in this story. For a single family camp, life could be precarious. A bad year for rain, a disease sweeping through the children, a fire that arrived at the wrong moment. Any of these could push a small group to the edge, but no camp was truly alone. Across Sahul, from the monsoon forests of the north to the dry heart and the southern plains, people wove themselves into a web of connections that stretched far beyond the horizon of any one person's daily walk. Long-distance ties mattered for simple human reasons. Marriage partners often came from other groups. A young woman might leave the people she grew up with and join her husband's community many days' travel away. A young man might do the same in reverse. Over generations, these patterns created chains of kinship that reached across whole regions. Your mother's brother's people might live far upriver. Your father's ceremonial allies might be known only by name and song, not by face. But they were still ours. These relationships were insurance. If your country was hit by drought, you could travel to in-laws on more fortunate ground, invoking shared obligations of hospitality. If a fire had sterilized a hunting area, in-laws could come to you when their own luck turned bad. Children who lost one parent might be fostered by relatives in distant places. No one group had to absorb every shock alone. The burden of bad years could be spread out across the network. Trade flowed along the same paths. Archaeologists can see it in the stubborn, silent language of stones and shells. Tools made from a particular kind of high-quality chert or silkreed tern, up hundreds of kilometres from the only known outcrops of that rock. Ground axe heads made of distinctive greenstone appear far from their quarry. Marine shells from one coast are found deep inland, pierced and polished into beads or ornaments. Each of these finds is a clue, a piece of obsidian in the Bismarck archipelago, whose chemistry matches a single volcanic island. Ochre from a famous quarry appearing in rock shelters far down the line. Seeds of plants that only grow in particular regions turning up as residues on grinding stones far away. None of this moved by accident. People carried it in personal bags, in trade bundles, as gifts, as part of ceremonial exchanges. The pattern they leave in the ground looks a bit like the pattern that once existed in people's minds, trails of connection, fanning out and crossing, linking country to country. where those trails met, meeting places emerged. Certain waterholes, rock outcrops, river junctions, and stretches of open plain became regular gathering sites where multiple groups came together. Not randomly, but according to law, at particular times of year, under particular conditions, for particular purposes. Here, ceremonies were held. Song cycles might be performed that required singers from many different countries, each responsible for their own verses. Initiation rites could bring together age mates from groups spread across a wide area, knitting them into a shared cohort with obligations that would last a lifetime. Disputes could be aired and settled, marriages arranged, news exchanged, agreements renewed. These gatherings were the social infrastructure of the continent. They maintained what anthropologists sometimes call shared law, systems of obligation, rights and responsibilities that extended far beyond any one local group. You didn't only belong to a camp or even a clan. You belonged to a network of people who held related stories about how the land had come to be, and who recognized one another as fitting into that story. That shared law helped information move in ways that are hard to see in the archaeological record, but easy to imagine. News of a failed wet season in the West could travel in fragments of conversation, in ritual songs adjusted to mention a drying river, in the absence of certain visitors who could not make their customary journey. Word of a new waterhole, a recently burned patch rich in fresh growth, an area where game was unusually plentiful, all this could pass from camp to camp, person to person. Often the news would move faster than the people who might eventually act on it. You might first hear about trouble 2 or 3 camps away, then about trouble 5 camps away. By the time the problem reached your own hunting grounds, you would not be completely surprised. You would know which direction to look for help, which relatives might be having a better year, which obligations you could call on. Knowledge about the seasons moved in similar fashion. In a continent where rainfall can be highly variable, local experience is invaluable, but so is second-hand information. If people returning from a gathering place reported late monsoon storms far to the north, or unseasonal flowering in a distant region, those observations might hint at what was to come for you. Over generations, such shared notice-taking could refine what people already knew from close observation of their own skies, winds, and plants. In the middle of the night, when the campfire burned low and people spoke quietly, they were not only telling old stories, they were also sharing fresh ones, about who had visited from where, who had married whom, where certain animals had been seen. In this way, the network stayed alive in memory as well as in movement. This book, by the way, follows those quiet threads in more depth. If you're curious, it's available at sleepytimehistory.com, and there's a discount there this week. Across tens of thousands of years, social cohesion like this is a survival trait as real as any stone tool. A single group can be wiped out by bad luck. A web of groups bound by marriage, trade, ceremony and law is much harder to destroy. When one strand breaks, others can take the weight. Knowledge lost in one line can survive in another. Children displaced by disaster can grow up elsewhere and carry their ancestors' stories back when conditions allow. In this way, the first Australians did more than persist on a difficult continent. They turned the continent itself into a network of relationships, routes of movement, paths of story, chains of obligation that could flex and shift as rivers changed course, as coasts drowned, as climates swung from one extreme to another. The land held them, and they held one another. If you pull back from all these details, the traded stones, the gathering places, the chains of kin, and look at the story as a whole, some things stand out more clearly than others. The first is timing. Most archaeologists working today would say that people reached Sahul very early on a world scale. Dates around 50,000 to 65,000 years ago turn up again and again, from sites like Madjedbib in the tropical north to Warati in the arid interior. from Devil's Lair in the southwest to early sites in New Guinea. The exact numbers are still argued over, 49,000 or 59,000 or 66,000, but the broad picture is stable. Within a few thousand years of leaving Eurasia, humans were living at the very edge of the Ice Age world. The second is spread. However they got in, by way of Timor or Sulawesi or other island chains now partly drowned, they didn't stay clustered near a single landfall. Within a relatively short window, people are visible in very different environments: monsoon forest and savanna, upland New Guinea valleys, temperate forests in the south, semi-desert in the centre. That tells us something powerful. It says that the first Australians were not simply beachcombers hugging one familiar coast. They were explorers moving inland, uphill, downriver, onto plateaus and into rock shelters, learning new places fast and making them home. The third is adaptation. Across the continent, in layers of ash, bone and stone, we see traces of a long conversation between people and country. Changes in tool types and raw materials, new grinding stones as plant foods become more important. Fire traces that line up with shifts in vegetation. Hunting strategies that seem to pivot as megafauna vanish and smaller, more wary animals take their place. All of it points in the same direction: an unfolding, flexible relationship with the land, tuned to local patterns, but part of a larger story of survival. Those are the parts of the picture that feel, for now, most solid. A very early arrival by global standards, a rapid widespread into many environments, a deep, continuous adaptation that links Ice Age camps to recent Aboriginal societies through lines of practice and story. And then there are the parts where the light fades and the edges blur. We do not know the exact route by which the first people reached Sahul. There are models. Some favour a northern track through Sulawesi and down toward New Guinea. Others picture a more southerly crossing via Timor toward northern Australia. Computer simulations of ocean currents and wind patterns show which crossings were most likely, which islands could have been stepping stones. But we do not yet have a neat trail of unmistakable campsites marching from west to east across the vanished islands of Wallacea. We also do not know precisely when the first feet touched Sahul's shore. Every new site pushes the dialogue a little. An older date here, a slightly younger one there. Radiocarbon, luminescence, uranium series dating, each method has its own strengths and its own shadows. At Majidbeeb, the earliest layers have produced some of the oldest claimed dates in Australia, but not all researchers agree on the interpretation. At other sites, layers have been disturbed by burrowing animals, tree roots or later human activity, blurring the record. Coastal gaps make the picture even harder to resolve. During the last ice age, sea level was much lower. Vast stretches of what would have been prime coastal living, estuaries, mangrove creeks, sandy beaches, low plains, now lie beneath tens of meters of water. If people first settled along those ancient shorelines, leaving hearths, middens and campsites, most of that early record is literally out of reach. What we find today are often the inland echoes of coastal lives. Shell beads far from the sea, marine fish bones carried upriver, styles of toolmaking that may have begun on a shore we can no longer see. Even on dry land, we are limited by what survives and what we have looked at. Rock shelters preserve better than open camps. Stone survives better than wood or fibre or skin. Sites that happen to lie near modern roads, mines, or towns are more likely to be investigated than those hidden in remote ranges or beneath thick alluvium. In between the famous places with names Madjed Bibi, Lake Mungo, Puritjara, Nawala Gabanmung, lie countless unknown camps, many of which may never be found. All this uncertainty can make the story feel slippery. One new date, and suddenly the headlines announce that the timeline has been rewritten. But most of the time, what changes is not the whole story, but the fine print. A new early site in the north might nudge the arrival window a few thousand years earlier, A revised date in the south might show that people reached a particular region faster than we thought. A submerged site found with underwater archaeology might confirm that coastal occupation was indeed as early and important as many have suspected. Each discovery is like adjusting the focus on a very old photograph. The shapes were already there. The new information sharpens lines, picks out details in the background, sometimes reveals that what we thought was a shadow is actually a person standing just out of frame. But the broad scene, the presence of people in Sahul very early, their wide spread, their long entanglement with country, remains. Underneath the technical debates about routes and dates, another pattern holds even more firmly: endurance. For tens of thousands of years, through glacial cold and rising heat, through the drowning of coastal plains and the drying of inland lakes, through the disappearance of giant animals and the arrival of new ones, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples kept living on this land. They kept maintaining law, transmitting knowledge, renewing ties of kinship and obligation. They kept telling stories that stitched people to place, ancestors to descendants, the seen world to the unseen. From the perspective of deep time, the exact year our species first set foot in Sahul is a narrow question. The wider question is how human lives once begun here could run on without break for so long. The answer, as far as we can glimpse it, lies in the things that leave only partial traces in stone and bone, in habits of sharing, in careful watching of seasons and skies, in songs that remember water in a dry country, in rules about marriage and ceremony that spread risk and responsibility, in a sense of belonging to country that is not ownership in the modern sense, but mutual obligation. The first Australians were not simply survivors of a harsh environment. They were participants in a relationship with land and sea that endured across more than 2,000 generations. The questions we argue about in journals, which route, which date, which tool type, are small ripples on the surface of that deeper continuity. As we drift toward the end of this story, you might imagine those first landfalls fading into the distance, like a shoreline seen across a long stretch of water. The details of the crossing are hazy. The exact path of the boat is unknown. But we know this: they made it across. They stepped onto new ground, and from that moment onward, human history and Australian country were braided together. From here we can let the arguments about dates and routes recede a little, like sounds on the far side of a hill, and follow instead the long, quiet thread of continuity into the deep night of the past. So, let that long, quiet thread carry you now, back from the arguments and the radiocarbon curves, back from the computer models of sea level and wind, back from the maps with arrows and dates. Drift instead along the path we have traced together, from a night on a distant shore in Southeast Asia, where a small group of people watched a dark line on the horizon and understood, somehow, that beyond it there was land, to the building of watercraft sturdy enough to ride swells and cross currents. Not myths of clumsy rafts, but deliberate journeys, watching stars and swells, feeling the wind, reading the flights of birds, remembering which way the swell pushes under the hull at certain times of year, turning all of that into a repeatable way of moving across water. To the first sight of Sahul itself, low headlands and long beaches, mangrove-fringed creeks, rivers carving through floodplains that no longer exist, a world of strange calls and unfamiliar scents, giant animals leaving tracks in wet sand, and behind that thin coastal ribbon, an entire continent waiting. Then inland, following fresh water, along rivers, up valleys, over low passes, across stony plains, people learning new plants, new winds, new dangers, working out which roots to soak, which seeds to roast, which animals to hunt in which season, leaving hearths and small scatters of stone in caves, under overhangs beside vanished lakes. From those first camps the spread continues, northward into the tropics, southward into cool forest and open grassland, across the inland ranges, onto the plateaus and into the gorges, out along what are now the continental shelves, living on coastal plains that today are drowned, their stories remembered on land in fragments and echoes. Day by day, season by season, the details are crate. Stone tools shift shape as new needs arise. Grinding stones appear as people lean harder on seeds and roots. Heat treatment of stone, careful fire use on country, new hunting strategies for smaller, quicker animals after the giants are gone. Networks of kin extend and interlock. Songs and stories track paths across hundreds, then thousands of kilometres. Through all the climate swings, the Ice Age maximums with their cold, dry winds, the slow warmings, the rising and falling of lakes and inland seas, the steady drowning of the continental shelves as the last great ice melted, people stay. They do not occupy the land as a brief episode between disasters. They grow with it, adjust to it, remember it. That is the deep continuity. When we talk about the first Australians, it can sound like a complete chapter written long ago and now closed. But on this continent, the story those first voyagers began has never stopped being told. The law, the relationships to country, the obligations to kin and to place, the songs that remember waterholes and tracks and ancestral events, these do not belong only to a remote Ice Age past. They are part of living cultures carried today by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. The archaeological record shows a line that is incredibly long. The people themselves carry the line into the present. So, as you lie here, maybe in the dark, listening, you can let the deep past and the present rest side by side. The flicker of a small fire in a Pleistocene rock shelter, the glow of whatever screen you're using now, the same human nervous system winding down for sleep, the same tendency to tell stories across the threshold between waking and dreaming. If you'd like to keep wandering through that deep time, I've also collected some of these prehistoric secrets about ancient humans, lost worlds, and the long arcs of climate and culture in a book you can read at your own pace. You can find out more and pick up a copy if you like at sleepytimehistory.com. And if this slow journey across Ice Age seas and through ancient Australian nights has helped you relax or taught you something new as you drift off, you can help this little corner of the internet keep going. When you have a spare moment, perhaps tomorrow after you've slept, you might tap the like button, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment. It makes a real difference to how many people get recommended these gentle history stories. I'd especially love to know where you're listening from. A city apartment half a world away from Sahul, a small town, a remote community, a student room, a night shift break room, a farm under big skies. Wherever you are, if you feel like sharing it in a comment, you'll be adding one more point of light to this quiet, scattered network of listeners. For now, though, you don't need to do anything at all. Just let the names and numbers soften and slip away. Let the last images of coasts and campfires fade. Imagine the first Australians settling in for their own nights, under stars that are still above you now, and feel yourself drifting with them into the long, deep night of history. And as you go, remember, this story is not only behind us, it continues in living cultures, in the land itself, and in the quiet human habit of telling one another tales in the dark until sleep comes.